Yeah, great. So what I propose to do here is as follows. This is just a brief overview. I give sort of a brief tour of the Sogdian corpora, including the epistolary corpora, followed by a discussion of epistolary matters. So looking at the structure of the Sogdian letter, looking at some of the main epistolary formulae from the earliest to the latest Sogdian texts, and then proceed to look at the Mook corpus. These are the early 8th century texts referred to in the title in a little bit more detail. And then in the reading, the second part, the reading part of the session today, we'll be reading selected Mook letters together as well. So letters constitute some of the major groups of Sogdian corpora. They are the earliest substantial Sogdian texts, the so-called ancient letters, which were written by Sogdian merchants in Western China in the early 4th century CE. They are also the only text corpus, or letters form a substantial part of the only text corpus found in Sogdiana itself. These are the Mook documents, dating to just before and just after the Arab conquest of Sogdiana in the early 8th century. Also, some of the latest and most substantial Sogdian texts coming from the Manichaean community at Turfan have a significant number and some very nice letters as well. The latest of these have been dated to the early 11th century, so we're getting already into the 2nd millennium there. And there are some other groups of Sogdian letters as well. For example, the Khotan letters, which were written by Sogdian merchants in Khotan, probably sometime in the 9th century. And there are a few other letters here and there, which I haven't put up, but sort of form part of the overall trajectory of Sogdian epistolary texts. And I will also note that although I kind of use the term letters and epistolary texts interchangeably, I should specify that all of the Sogdian letters that are known to us so far are actually private letters. That is, they were real documents that were sent or intended to be sent from one party to another party, though not always received by that other party, rather than literary collections of letters or model letters. So there aren't any sort of transmitted literary works that include famous letters of the past or anything like that. These are all, well, as Arazu put it, we're actually reading other people's mail in a literal sense here. And the other thing is that I want to emphasize, and I hope you'll agree with me, and we can come back to thinking about this at the end of this first part, or at the end of the real talk part, that we can indeed speak of a Sogdian epistolary tradition, given the consistency of letter structure and the consistency of the location and use of epistolary formulae and other formalities of Sogdian letters. There's a consistency that sort of stretches over these 800 years that we have Sogdian texts attested. And I think that's good grounds to talk about a Sogdian epistolary tradition, as opposed to just sort of random collections of texts that happen to be letters in Sogdian. The letters fit into the overall timeline of Sogdian corpora as follows. So the earliest known Sogdian texts, the cultural inscriptions, are very early. They predate the so-called ancient letters by some time, although it's not certain by how much. The ancient letters coming from the early 300s. In the mid 500s, we get tomb inscriptions of Sogdians living in China, sort of what is now central China. A contract for the sale of a slave from the Sogdian merchant community in Turfan in the early 600s, 639 to be exact. Then the aforementioned Mook documents. The Buddhist texts from Dunhuang, from the famous cave at Dunhuang, probably date to the 8th century in general. They might be a little earlier, might be a little later. Only one of those texts is dated, and it's dated to 728, I think. The Khotan letters, Christian texts written in a version of the Syriac script from the Christian community at Turfan, probably covering more or less the 10th century. And then the Manichaean, actually, and Buddhist texts as well from Turfan, which probably also cover something like some of the 9th, 10th, and the early 11th century. So these are sort of, I've left out, this isn't an exhaustive presentation of all the Sogdian texts. There are Sogdian graffiti, various other Sogdian inscriptions, but this gives you sort of the general idea. And what's interesting about pretty much about Sogdian in general is that the vast majority of texts come from outside of Sogdiana, and they're written by people using Sogdian as a mercantile language, sort of mercantile communities or religious communities using Sogdian as a religious language. So probably most of these people are Sogdian themselves, Sogdian speakers in the Manichaean community that can be discussed. And here just on a map, so you can visualize it a little bit more, are the epistolary collections. So here are the Mook letters coming from obviously sort of the heart of Sogdiana. The Khotan letters, the ancient letters were found to the west of Dunhuang. There are some other letters that come from the Dunhuang caves themselves, and then the various letters from Turfan. So let's just get right into it and start talking about letter structure. So I distinguish a 3 or 4 part structure to Sogdian letters, and this kind of threefold structure is pretty common to ancient and late antique letter traditions. If you look at kinds of the corpora of letters in any of the late antique major languages, you can find arguments about this kind of threefold structure, something to do with an introduction, the presentation of the actual material, the message that's to be conveyed, and something like a conclusion. Sort of borrowing from studies of other epistolary corpora, I termed these the prescript, the proem, the body, and then the postscript. And sort of for more details about this, and for more details about the many epistolary formulae which exist and which we don't have the time to discuss all of them today, I refer you to my recent book on the subject, Studies in the Sogdian Epistolary Tradition. So these parts of the Sogdian letters can be distinguished by their content, but also, of course, by their location. So in the prescript, this is kind of the initial section that contains the address information. So who the sender is, who the addressee is, their names, titles, and that kind of thing. And the proem is this kind of passage that follows the giving of address information with mostly formulaic, say, wishes for health, greetings, that kind of thing. But it precedes, it's almost entirely formulaic, and it precedes the sort of body which contains the actual message that is to be sent. And the body is the least formulaic part of the letter, although it does also have some formulae that occur in it. And the postscript in the Sogdian tradition, at least, is typically just a verbatim repeat of the prescript. So restating the addressee and sender information, sometimes with a date, mostly without a date. And so this is why there's a 3 or 4 part, depending on the corpora. And what I argue is that these sections are mostly stable over time. And we can find that sort of whatever the situation is and however the epistolary formulae change over time, their sort of location and their respective locations in the letter is relatively stable. And so we can find a sort of prescript and a proem and so forth in all of these various letter corpora. So for example, if we just look at a typical letter from the Mook collection, which I'll start here and we'll circle back to the ancient letters for reasons which will become clear later. If we look at where the address, and so we'll look at the formulae in a little bit later, and so I just wanted to concentrate on the sort of structure, the overall structure of the letters. If we look at where the addressee and sender information are located, they come right at the beginning of the letter, including necessary titles, what have you, obviously the words to and from. And they are typically followed after both the to and the from are followed by whatever greetings and well wishes are necessary or appropriate given the context of the letter, the relative sort of social positions of the parties, how much you're trying to make the other party feel good, and so forth. To sort of demarcate the different sections, scholars looking at other traditions, such as early Arabic letters and so forth, have sort of come up with a concept of a transitional element, sometimes called a trigger, which is some kind of formulaic word or expression which serves to sort of signpost that a new section is beginning. In the Sogdian epistolary corpora as a whole, this is typically the word patishkawan, which I translate as letter, and is one of the words that is used to refer to letters, but its sort of original meaning is something like a humble request or an entreaty. But you very often find this right after the address information and before any greetings or salutations, and it doesn't really fit into any sentence. It occurs before the beginning of a new sentence in the greeting, which in Sogdian is often marked by this conjunction erti. And it also doesn't fit syntactically into the sender or addressee information. So in some editions, you find something translated like, this is a letter sent from so-and-so to so-and-so, but syntactically it doesn't really work, and it doesn't really work when you look at how other letters are structured as well. So we have this transitional element, and then we have some greetings, the expressions of homage and some good wishes, and then the letter moves on to the text of the body, for which there's not necessarily a consistent transitional element in the Sogdian text, but often you find some kind of expression resuming a previous communication. So something like the message that there was, or I received your previous message, in your previous message you said, something like that. So just to sort of resume the thread of conversation and then move into the actual content. And then, as I mentioned, the postscript, which is not always attested. So sometimes the letter is damaged and the end isn't there. So we don't know if there was a postscript in that particular document. Sometimes it's simply left out. But when it's there, it's mostly just a verbatim repeat of the address information. This is what it looks like on the actual manuscript, and this is one of the ones that we'll read later. The addressee, of course, comes first. The sender is next, and the sender is indented. This doesn't always happen in Sogdian text, but you find this indentation where the sender information is set in a little bit from the addressee, seemingly as a kind of sign of humility or deference. And the result of this is that it ends up emphasizing the addressee visually and sort of removing the sender visually. This transitional element, patishkawan, simply comes immediately after on the line. So you don't get a lot of line breaks for content-related purposes in these documents. And then the greetings just also continue straight along the next lines. When the greetings end here with this word, so if you are well, then I rejoice, the text of the body continues, and then at the end you get the postscript, so addressee and sender together. Looking at another letter from the Mook corpus, and this is a typical letter from a superior to an inferior, so in this case from Devastich, the sort of last king of Sogdiana, well, to anybody else, because anybody else would have been an inferior to the king. Well, anyone else in a Sogdian context, that is, we'll see how that differs sort of across sides and later. But in these contexts, the sender actually comes first because of the social hierarchy. So with the previous one, we saw how the addressee comes first. Here, the sender comes first, the address comes next, and then there's a very sparse greeting. So just, greetings, much homage, the end. So the proem in letters from a superior to an inferior is very short because there's not a need to express much homage or well wishes or humility or anything like that. And the body is sort of, these messages tend to be kind of terse in general. They just get to the point, which is giving some order or another. But structurally, you find the elements in the same places. So the prescript contains just the address information. The proem contains a greeting, however short. And then the postscript is just a repeat of the prescript. Moving to another letter corpus, this is one of the Khotan letters, which seems to be sent from one member of a merchant community to another. This one has an additional element at the beginning, which I've just called an invocation, borrowing from, I think, Eva Marie Grobe's work on Arabic letters. It's sort of just like a header or a title, talking about or labeling the text, as it were. You get the address and sender information. The formula used for these are a little bit more elaborate. So there's a little bit more of an expression of kind of praise for the addressee of the letter, a little bit more elaborate expression of humility for the sender of the letter, but these occur in the same place. You get this transitional element again, Patishkawan, and then in this case, a more elaborate greeting and salutation as well. Then the body continues. There are some formulaic parts, like there's a common formula, something like, may you be informed of my news, now you are informed of my news, that kind of thing. And the end of the letter is not attested. So who knows, in the Khotan letters, the postscript could have been something different if it was there at all, but it's just not attested in any of that, any of those letters. So some of the examples from the Turfan corpus are particularly nice because these are beautiful illuminated letters that were sent to a figure called the Mojak, who was the sort of highest ranking Manichaean official, something like a bishop or cardinal of the entire region, if not of the whole Manichaean world at that time. And so these are sent by other Manichaean officials as reports to this very highest Manichaean official, and as you might expect, are very flowery, very elaborate, full of expressions of praise, very overwrought, in fact. So they're quite long, but again, you can identify how the letter structure is quite consistent. So you have the address information, very elaborate, takes 25 lines simply to list the addressee. The sender is also sort of a little bit elaborate in its expressions of humility. There's this transitional element, and then another 25 lines or so of greetings, right? So to His Glorious Majesty, with head lowered to the ground and respectful greetings, blah, blah, blah. Very elaborate, but probably sort of required when you're writing this type of figure. Then there's the body, and the postscript in this case is interesting because it does have a date formula, and then it repeats the address information in an abbreviated manner, so without all of the elaborate formulae of praise and humility. So just to give you a view of the text as a whole, I've sort of color coded this, and you see that it basically is 55 lines just to give the address information. So the prescript and the proem are 55 lines in total, extremely elaborate. And this is the sort of, it's an illuminated scroll, and it takes you to about just under halfway through the letter, just to convey the appropriate formulations for the address and expressions of greeting and salutations. And then the rest of the letter is actually just reporting on what hymns were sung on particular occasions and so forth. So nothing of great consequence. But you can also see that here in the illumination is the final line of the addressee part of the letter, giving the Mojak and his title, His Glorious Majesty. And so you can really see how it is arranged to sort of foreground the rank and title of this figure. And then of course, we also have this nice indentation for humility, and this is the part that contains the sender information. And this is a really great text. And thankfully, there's a new English edition of these Bezeklik letters published by Yoshida just a year or two ago. Okay, so now if we circle back to the ancient letters, I begin with the Mook corpus on because there the letter structure is a bit more stable. But when we come back to the ancient letters, we see, and these are some 400 years before the Mook documents. So there's actually quite a gap in the documentation of Sogdian between these ancient letters, and there's just a few texts and then the Mook corpus. So we see that the letter structure is on the whole quite similar, but it shows a little more variation. So in these letters, the greeting always immediately follows, or almost always immediately follows, the addressee, which means that it intervenes between the addressee and in the sender. And when you look at all of the later Sogdian letters, the greeting formula never intervenes into the address information. It always follows both the giving of both parties. So here, and the addressee and sender sort of vary in the ancient letters corpus as well, depending on presumably the relation between the sender and receiver of the letter. But in 4 of them, you see that the greeting intervenes between the addressee and sender, followed by the salutation. And then in 2 other cases, you find that the sender comes first, followed by the addressee, followed by the greeting and salutation. So for these reasons, it's kind of hard to separate out a prescript and a proem for the ancient letters corpus. And there's also no transitional element like that patishkoan that I mentioned to introduce the greeting or introduce a second part of the letter after the prescript. And so for the ancient letters, I just group all of these together as the prescript. There's no proem. And then you have a body. And then the postscript for the ancient letters only gives a dating formula. It doesn't repeat the address information from the prescript. So when we look tradition as a whole, we see that there's some overall consistency. And of course, there's some development as we might expect, because we're talking about, in some respects, disparate communities and the passage of quite a bit of time. And there's definitely development in the epistolary formulae, which we'll look at next. But viewed all together, we see that the same elements occur more or less in the same places and in the same order in all of these different examples of Sogdian letters. So if you arrange them like this, you can kind of see that there is a structural consistency. And this is one of the arguments that I have for the existence of an epistolary tradition, this sort of consistency despite differences in place and time, different types of communities, and so on and so forth. How am I doing on time?
Oh, good. Yeah, I would say, I think you've only gone for like 25 minutes. So,
okay. Yeah. So let's go through some of the epistolary texts, the epistolary formulae, and I'll try to keep this relatively brief. And again, this is just some sort of representative formulae, so you can see how they develop over time while sort of retaining the same core elements. And I definitely want to make sure to leave time to talk about the Mook texts. So I will go through this. So beginning with the prescript, we have the address information is given in a consistent way. The earliest texts have a relatively minimal version of this. So just to the Lord Ruler or to the noble ruler. In the Mook documents, this is extended with this optional sort of epithet of great hope. And this can even be extended further by saying, to the noble Lord, great hope, greater than every hope. As time goes on, we see that this element of great hope is retained, and the sort of the first words of like to the noble Lord are retained, but this kind of element of praise or whatever, elevation of station can be elaborated upon. So great hope, greater than every hope, dear, excellent, revered master. And then the name of the addressee comes after that. One of the Khoten letters is sent to a woman, so it's to the noble lady, same formula, right? Greater than every hope, more important than every person. So this core element can kind of be elaborated upon depending on the needs of the particular communication. And likewise, in the Turfan collection, we find sort of the latest representative of the Sogdian tradition, even more elaboration is possible. So you can say something like more excellent than my own 2 eyes, more excellent than every person in the living world. So just adding to the elements that are already there. For the sender, it's sort of the same thing. We always get this formulation involving the word servant. So the ancient letters simply have sent from servant, so-and-so. And in the Mook documents, likewise, sent from your servant, but more adjectives expressing humility can be added. So in this case, humble or insignificant, literally 1/1,000,000th. So sent from your humble, insignificant servant is a possibility. In the Khotan letters, we find for the first time this formulation of a sort of servant who has not served and not arrived at service, your well-wisher and friend. And this formulation also appears in the Turfan letters. So for example, in those Bezeklik letters, which I mentioned. And again, you see that the sort of first element is always the same. So from your, and then all of these epithets and adjectives are appended in the middle. And then the word sort of servant comes at the very end, followed by the name or title of the sender, whoever that is. So these Bezeklik letters obviously sent to a very high-ranking authority, a little bit more elaborate in terms of the humility, right? So your order listening or obedient servant, that kind of thing. But only when you have letters that are sent from a superior to an inferior do you do away with the term servant and you just use that person's name or title instead. So one of the Turfan letters is apparently sent from a queen of Ark, a sort of location in that region. And she just writes, so from your hopeful, well-wishing, humble, so using the same formulaic elements, but queen of Ark rather than servant. The other interesting thing is that, so, you can always see some kind of change going on besides the formula getting more elaborate. You can also see some elements dropping out. So the ancient letters and the Mook documents are the only ones which use this word sent. And then that disappears from the address, from the sender information in the subsequent corpora for whatever reason. I mean, I suppose it's obvious that you're talking about the sender at this point anyways. The greeting, so in the proem, I distinguished two sort of separate formulae, the greeting and the salutation. The greeting is kind of where you find like an expression of homage. And the salutation is where you find expressions for, good health, good wishes, that kind of thing. If you're doing well, I'm doing well, and so forth. So with the greeting, and this is what we find so often today, right? Like when you begin an email with the phrase, like, I hope this email finds you well, or something like that, right? So that's the proem of your email. In the ancient letters, you find this formulation of blessings and homage being expressed, so afriwan machu. And this can just be elaborated on while always retaining these kinds of core elements. So instead of saying blessings and homage, you can say 1,000 blessings and homage. Or you can say, 1,000 blessings and homage on bended knee as is offered to the gods, or if I might pay homage to you from nearby as sort of in parentheses, one does to the gods. So you always have this kind of, the homage is always what's occurring here. And likewise in the Mook documents, you can find expressions like much homage, or I send the noble Lord, your majesty, much homage. Of course, if it's Devashtich, the king writing to anybody else, he doesn't bother with paying them homage. He just says, hail. So drod, which is cognate with Middle Persian, drod. Or he might say, drod, gharfi macho, so, hail, much homage, the end. Right, so same thing in the Khotan documents, the sort of formulaic expression of homage is consistent, even when it's not really obvious that the figures are royal figures. They seem to be trading partners or sort of roughly to be peers to each other, but you nevertheless have this formulaic element there. And this example is from the previous one sent by the Queen of Ark. And it's interesting because it has this echo of the formula from the ancient letters there. So we pay homage to you as one pays homage to the Buddhas of the various periods. So using a locally relevant sort of divine element there, but the formula is sort of interestingly parallel to that of the ancient letters. So again, although the formulae can be varied, they do vary over time, and they can be varied depending on who the parties of the correspondence are. we see a kind of consistency throughout. We can talk about this transitional element perhaps later on. I'll skip it for now so we can talk more about the Mook corpus. This is just another example of sort of an aerial feature in the formulaic parts of the letter. Okay, so moving on to the Mook documents. These again are the only corpus of text discovered in Sogdiana itself and are a part of the archives of Devastich. So he's now famous, of course, as the last king of Sogdiana. And he was eventually defeated at sort of his last holdout at Mount Mook, which was a fort very far up on the Zarashan River, way past Panjikent, for example. And he was executed by Arab conquerors in 722. So since the rediscovery of these texts and the story of Devastich sort of becoming known, he's also become something of a folk hero in Tajikistan, as you see here with statues dedicated to him, although I don't know on what basis, you know, his likeness has been drawn from. Here you see the hill where the fort, which I think since it's mostly collapsed, was located overlooking the Zarashan River. And as I said, Mount Mook was quite a ways up the Zarashan, well past Samarkand and Panjikent. So it was part of a pre-existing system of fortifications and watchtowers, but you can also imagine how much of a last resort it was for Devastich and his crew, given that he sort of, I think originally is from Panjikent, but sort of claimed to be a ruler of Samarkand at some point, but you know, he's basically relegated to holding out in a small fort quite far away from everything. In the 1930s, the remnants of this archive were located by chance, as so many ancient documents are. And subsequent excavations by Soviet scholars came away with dozens of texts, mostly in Sogdian, but also one in Arabic, one in Old Turkic, and a few scraps with Chinese characters on them, as well as textiles and other artifacts. Some of these documents were certainly part of the archive of Devastich and must have been brought with him as he took refuge at Mount Mook. However, many of the texts have no obvious connection to him, and they were sent and received by other people entirely. And so perhaps these were people who were joining Devastich at his last stand, and they also brought parts of their own correspondence or own archives with them. And this all just ended up together in the end in this fort. So in some sense, this is kind of an accidental grouping of documents. It's not necessarily the official archive of Devastich alone. And even if it is, it's obviously only part of what would have been the total archive of Devastich. And only a few of these documents are dated. These range from preceding the rule of Devastich in the early 700s, referring to other kings, to being dated right up until before he was captured, which should have been something like mid-August 722, and there are documents that are dated to the first and second year of Devastich as King of Sogdiana, which it's a title that he should have claimed around 719, 2021. So these are the only ones that are really securely dated. There are a couple more, but there are some interesting arguments on the relative chronology of the texts using their contents in comparison with what the historian At-Tabari relates of these events. And for that, I refer you to the study of Koné and de la Vessière. So this corpus can be broken down by, and I should also say that although they're not strictly speaking from Mount Mook itself, I include the small number of texts discovered, I believe, by Pavlovia's expedition or excavations at Hisorak. More recently, I include those in the Mook corpus simply because they're clearly part of the same system of sort of early 8th century administrative Sogdian. And the fort at well, I guess, medieval Martskat is also part of that same system of fortifications that Mount Mook and other locations would have been part of. So I sort of have just added those into the Mook corpus as well. Right. So we can kind of like break down this corpus of text in a number of ways. One is by material or writing support. There are, according to my count, 14 documents on paper. This paper is often described as Chinese paper or Chinese silk paper, but I don't know that it has actually ever been tested or sort of scientifically investigated. I think Chinese paper is a strong likelihood, but we don't know that for sure. There are 28 documents on parchment, and there are 30, including the Hisorak texts, on wood sticks. Then there are 8 uncertain, which is a little bit strange how a writing support can be uncertain, but as far as I can gather in the literature, they are just referred to as paper/leather. And I imagine on closer investigation, one will be able to determine if it is in fact paper or parchment. In terms of the type of document that we're talking about, there are 4 contracts, and there are 36 letters, and there are 45 or so receipts, sort of economic documents, orders, that kind of thing. Some of them are addressed from one party to another party, but they aren't letters in the kind of epistolary sense that I have been talking about, although perhaps you can argue that they should be brought into the corpus nevertheless. Looking at the letters part of the corpus in particular, one might ask how writing support correlates with social status, the context of the letter, the chronology of the documents, the location that they were sent from or to, or any other factors. One might think, for example, that writing supports align with socio-political status, so that the sort of highest ranking people are sending and receiving documents on the most prestigious writing support. But that doesn't sort of work out entirely. So for Devastich, for example, sends and receives multiple letters on both parchment and paper. But two cases are quite noteworthy, and one is that Devastich has a letter written to Al-Jarrah ibn Abdullah, which is in Arabic on parchment. And Abdurrahman bin Subh has a letter to Devastich in Sogdian on paper. And these are the documents V12. So the Mook system is usually referred to with Russian letters, right? So this is a V12. And let's see, oops. Yes, so these are quite interesting, right? So clearly, Abdurrahman bin Subh had somebody in his employ who could produce a perfectly proper Sogdian letter, right? In very nice Sogdian handwriting and in complete accordance with Sogdian epistolary norms. So this is otherwise perfectly good Sogdian letter. It just has a few Sogdian calques on Arabic Islamic formulations, which we can talk about in the second part. And Devastich, on the other hand, had somebody in his retinue who could produce an Arabic document in accordance with the Arabic norms of the time. So obviously, we're talking about there's Sogdian scribes which could be hired by the Arabs once they had conquered a certain amount of Sogdiana, and for whatever reason, because of Devastich's sort of initial alliance or client status with the Arab leaders, maybe he was given an Arab scribe who could produce these kinds of documents, and then they could exchange this correspondence. So what's interesting is that these writing supports are perhaps unexpected, and Marina Rusto has made some interesting arguments that basically if paper was the prestige material for Sogdians, then the Arabs decided to write a letter on that prestige material paper, and vice versa. If the Sogdians knew that parchment was a prestige material for the Arabs, then they caused the letter to be composed on parchment instead of paper for sending to, and so that may explain the choice, right, to write on the prestige material of the intended recipient. But when it comes to the other sort of officials and characters in this archive, the correlation of writing support with other factors is not yet really clear. So I've tried to sort of, there isn't an obvious connection with chronology. There isn't an obvious connection with location necessarily. So for example, it's not the case that wood sticks were only used late in the game or late before the sort of conquest of Mount Mook, that we can tell so far. as opposed to paper and parchment. So this character from Avar Ut, who's sort of Devastich's second in command, a type of like major domo type figure, he said he receives letters on paper and parchment, both from Devastich and from other khubs, who are these kind of local lords. And he also receives letters on sticks from other khubs, and he issues receipts on both to other people on both parchment and paper. And it's not quite obvious yet to me yet how this might break down according to any factors, besides perhaps what was at hand. And then other minor khubs in the area send and receive letters on paper, parchment, sticks as well. So it's not strictly about location. It's not strictly about social status either. So you can kind of imagine, and I refer you to Michael Shenkar's piece on the Sogdian civic communities for more details, but you can imagine there's this network of locations, and each of them has a khub sort of representative or lord of some type, not the sole ruler of the place necessarily. And they are sending and receiving documents in this network, but it's not obvious why the choice of writing material yet. I think there's kind of been a theory that the willow sticks maybe are like a lower status writing material, or that, when Devastich was in his last days at Mount Mook, he only had sticks available to him. But this doesn't quite work out, because you see that the sticks are written in what is otherwise a comparable good quality of handwriting as letters on other documents. They make use of the same format, the same structure, the same epistolary formulae. So they're otherwise perfectly good letters. And some of the sticks are quite big as well. I think even a meter wide. The Hisarok texts seem to be a little bit of less quality, but they otherwise, so for example, even here on this sort of small stick from Hisarok, you can see this indentation. There's an indentation here for like the sender and receiver part of the letter. So it's still adhering to what are otherwise the norms of like the epistolary tradition. So I don't really know what to make of the sticks yet, other than that it might have been for certain locations simply what they had access to instead of parchment or paper, but not that it correlated with a sort of lower prestige or lower social status as such. So taking the corpus as a whole, you can also kind of begin to map out the networks of correspondence, and you can also sort of begin to see the relations between the parties by their respective uses of epistolary formulae and their titles and so forth, which I've begun to do. So if you start off with Devastich, the archive only preserves letters sent by him to 3 individuals. So there's the one to Al-Jarrah in Arabic. There's letters to his second in command, sort of from Avar Ut. And he sends letters to another khub named Afshun from a location called Khakhsar. And you can break this down. You can continue to sort of map this out for all of the other letters in the collection. So for example, he receives that one from Abdurrahman bin Subh. He receives one from this individual named Fatufan. He receives text from Andar Ut, who himself receives text from other characters. And you can kind of, so there's characters that send text to Devastich and also to other local leaders. And there are also texts that don't have any obvious connection with Devastich and are sent and received between either individuals or between khubs of 2 different locations. But these all somehow ended up in this archive at Mount Mook. And I think, as I mentioned, sort of the directionality of letters also sort of intersects with social hierarchy. So, by looking kind of at the epistolary formula, you can get an idea of where all of these characters fall in this kind of overall like late Sogdian sort of social hierarchy.
So Adam, please feel free to keep going. This is fascinating. But yeah, I just wanted to let you know, because you'd asked, we're about at the 45-minute mark. But please feel free to keep
Thanks.
going.
I'm jumping up actually, so this is good. We can skip that for now. And I just wanted to come back to some sort of additional thoughts again, if we can speak of a Sogdian epistolary tradition. I know that is potentially in question for Middle Persian, which we'll find out more about later on in the term. But I what's interesting about this collection is that we don't have, or about Sogdian epistolary tradition, is that we don't have any information beside the letters themselves so far. So there's no texts which talk about composing letters. There aren't any which sort of transmit like, canonical or famous letters. There aren't any stylistic guides. There's hardly any reference to scribes. There are a few scribes, but there are, not a lot of reference to writing implements. So there isn't that kind of secondary information that we can use to reconstruct how the other sort of aspects of an epistolary tradition. But it's just obvious to me, and I think that some tradition was preserved and maintained. So, in the diaspora, people continued to learn how to write Sogdian according to Sogdian letters and compose Sogdian letters according to norms that were centuries old. And this implies obviously the existence of, training of some sort. And so I think I'll just end on that point, refer you to some, additional readings for additional context, especially on Sogdiana itself. And, I hope we have some time for a few questions if there are any. Thank you very much again for your attention.